Okay, let's break down the testimony right now of these two witnesses with my very special guest joining me on this Monday morning, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, great to have you back here on the program.
Good to be with you, my friend.
Now, I am going to ask you in a little bit the difficulty of trying to prosecute this case without a body, but before we do that, you have investigated a lot of different crime scenes, and the idea of matching a car to, with surveillance footage to the car that the Moores may have been driving, I'm curious your reaction to seeing some of that testimony.
I was on last week, covering this with Rachel, and I watched this thing over and over again kind of pass by, and for me, I can't make heads or tails out of it. And it wasn't plain to me. And so therefore I assume that it's not going to be plain to the jury. It requires, they had to bring in an expert to actually say, this is what you're seeing. So for me, it's kind of thin. If we're just looking at from a scientific perspective, it's hard for me to kind of balance this.
Okay, well, you know who didn't like this? The defense. So let's see how they did when they cross-examined these witnesses. The first one is who they cross-examined was Joyce Ayland. Okay, so there's a lot of trucks in that area. Maybe this truck driving at the early morning hours is not as suspicious as the prosecution would like everyone to believe. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I'm going to ask you the question I mentioned at the beginning of the program. How difficult is it to get a case here, prosecute a kidnapping case, when there is no body?
I don't know how you go about it. I was actually reading the South Carolina statute, some of the elements that are in place in order to justify or to charge someone with kidnapping. And the language is kind of interesting. Seize, confine, inveigle, decoy, kidnap, abduct, carry away. And that's kind of the heart. That's the heart of it, Jesse. I'm thinking, how do you go about proving this? The one thing that they're kind of dependent upon right now is this vehicle. And obviously, there was the infamous phone call from the phone booth, all these sorts of things, and the pregnancy test. But it's not illegal to buy a pregnancy test. So I don't know. It just, for me, just looking through my logical mind, as logical as that can possibly be, I have to say it's a bit thin for me. It's a bit thin. You have to, in order to charge someone even with kidnapping, you have to kind of show possession of someone.
Yeah,
at some point in time. And I just don't know if they've gone to that point.
They initially charged the Moores with murder and dropped those charges, maybe because they didn't have a body. Well, we'll talk more about it. We're going to take a quick break, and there is a lot more to discuss in this case. Stay tuned. All right, so in his opinion so far, it's that car that was driving one way and coming back is the same car. We're going to learn a little bit later what, in his opinion, what that car matches. So we'll talk more about him in a second. Let's bring back Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, talking about the idea of there's no body here. So when is a disappearance, or how is a disappearance classified as a killing, as a homicide? Because remember, these two people were first charged with murder, and those charges were dropped. In general, how do you classify a disappearance as a murder?
Well, I think from an investigative standpoint, you would have to have something like an eyewitness, maybe even an ear witness, someone hearing the victim or seeing the victim proclaiming, I'm being taken, maybe hearing a gunshot. And then as far as physical evidence in a case like this, we would be looking for things like copious amounts of blood at the scene of where they were abducted from. And this brings me to a point here where, this boat landing, which is very isolated, it's out in a rural area along this stretch in a wildlife refuge. I'm wondering, Jesse, if there is a public restroom there. I tried to pull up some images of this thing. I saw a porta-john that was out there, but I really wonder, if you're going to facilitate something and kind of like this, if you're going to kill someone, a bathroom would be a fantastic way to do this. It would be isolated. I wonder if the bathroom was searched thoroughly for any kind of blood evidence that might be left behind.
That's fascinating. I mean, It's so eerie. We don't know what happened to her, and we're trying to get a better understanding of that. We have to take a quick break, but there's a lot more to discuss. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. So in his opinion, that truck was the same one that matched that of the Moores. And he also said that while he couldn't determine by 100% certainty where the truck was going, in his opinion, he believed that that vehicle and Heather Elvis's phone were converging towards the same area. That's a huge, huge piece of evidence for the prosecution. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, what did you think about his testimony?
I thought that within his context, he's speaking what he perceives is the truth, and that's fine. It's difficult. It's difficult with the type of images that he is working with. At the end of the day, you can have these images, but can you sell it to the jury? And is it convincing? This is not like, say, for instance, looking at a comparison of, say, ballistic evidence, where you have a projectile recovered at the scene and a test fired bullet recovered, in a lab where it's tangible, it's tactile, you can compare it. You're asking the jury to kind of take a leap of faith here.
And one of the most eerie things is the fact that Heather Elvis's body has never been discovered. So you have seen probably a lot of these cases. How do you make someone disappear? No trace of them, especially in this area.
Well, actually, I've given some thought to this, Jesse. This is not dissimilar. The area is not dissimilar from where I began my career down in South Louisiana. They're at a boat launch, and this is a marshy area. It's not really too far away from the Atlantic Ocean, from Myrtle Beach. And there's all manner of wildlife in this area. Of course, there are gators that are out there in the swampy area. I hate to be so coarse, but that's just the reality of it. I think one of my problems with this is that you would have to have more than one vehicle involved, and the other vehicle that I'm thinking about is a boat. And if you're at a boat landing, is there a boat? Do they have access to a boat? Is there evidence that a boat was launched? And in order to get this person out, because you can't just, I guess you could just simply push them off of the boat launch after you facilitated their death and hope against hope that something's going to happen. But most of the time it would require for you to go down this river, and this river is rather long. It kind of weaves and turns and that sort of thing through this marshy area, and you would want to deposit the body in kind of a sequestered area to give nature a chance to dispose of it for you.
Well, it's difficult to imagine that this happened to this young girl, and even more difficult to imagine that someone did this to her. I mean, this is really, really some sick stuff we're talking about. But we're going to take a quick break, Joseph. But don't worry, because we have a lot to talk about, including how authorities tracked Heather Elvis using her cell phone. A lot more to talk there. We'll be right back. All right, so what we're learning from this cell phone tracking expert is where Miss Elvis's phone was going that night. We know we tracked it from her house. She was driving around, and then we know it's eventually going to land at that boat landing where that was the last activity from that cell phone. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, what do you think about this analysis in terms of trying to track where she was that night and where she ultimately ended up?
Yeah, Jesse, this grabs my attention much more than the videography evidence. I think that maybe at the end of the day, it'll be the sum totality of the evidence. This guy paints a picture, again, that the jury can grasp here, whereas the videography stuff is a bit more nebulous, if you will. Everybody can identify with a cell phone and the movement of that cell phone. He talks about, some of the technology I've heard. And of course, these guys always talk about the triangulation, being able to pinpoint the movement of this thing vis-a-vis the surrounding cell towers. And he's being very exacting. I think that this is something that the members of the jury can actually sink their teeth into, because it's something that they understand. It's something that's daily used by everyone. So her movement is quite compelling. And they're saying she as opposed to the phone, though, which I prefer in forensic terms to say her phone was here as opposed to she was here.
Right, because you don't know if she was actually the one carrying the phone.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's too many unanswered questions here, and so there is movement of the phone, and of course it leads them back to eventually where the last ping that they received was out at the the now infamous Peachtree Landing.
Have you seen situations where we're interpreting this as her movements, but it's later determined later on that that really wasn't true? Somebody else was holding the phone, or the data was unreliable. I mean, we're using Google information right here to track where she was.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's just say that this was a kidnapping, and maybe the phone took a different track than the actual person did. If you were able to dislodge it from their hand, so it's a bit of a leap to again say that this is her. If you separate that phone from her, it's going to give you the impression that maybe she's moving with the phone. You don't know that for a fact, but still, it's more solid, I think, than the videography.
You talked about earlier how you can dispose of a body in this way, and you talked about, as unfortunate as it is, that there's crocodiles in this area. Realistically, can that dispose of any trace of a body? I mean, yes, it's in the water. Yes, they may get rid of it, but there's nothing else from that landing. There's no evidence left behind from an animal, disposing of a body like that.
No, not particularly. Not in the case of alligators that we have throughout the South here in these wetland areas. And generally, what they do, people have the impression that alligators act as sharks do. They don't. They take a remain and essentially place it into. Some people actually refer to it as a meat locker. That they'll take their tail and kind of swish beneath the edge of a bank and place remain beneath the bank and allow the meat to become seasoned, because they don't have, we always hear about how, and you can see people holding the jaws of an alligator shut like this. They don't have a very much power opening their jaws. So what I mean by all of this is it's very difficult for them to eat things. So it takes a while for the tissue to tenderize for them to eat it. They'll go back after a period of time.
Oh my gosh. And I know we have no indication of this, and we only have about 10 seconds left, but any idea if she was alive, or would it be more easier to kill her and then dispose of the body to the crocodiles?
Yeah, that's $1 million question here, Jesse. That's why I go back to this boat landing and any kind of bathroom facilities that they may have had there. How well was this area searched? And also, was there a boat? I always ask myself there, what's your purpose in going to a boat landing?
Joseph, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, there's so much more to discuss. Thank you. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, so now we're getting into a little bit more of the personal life of Heather Elvis, and we're starting to understand her relationship with Sydney Moore. I'm back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. And Joseph, we're listening to this, and we're getting a sense of how their romance first began. What do you think of it?
Well, it's certainly it certainly humanizes, I think, her a little bit, and humanizes the world in which she indwelled. Because again, we're essentially just dwelling right now in a case involving a person that's no longer here, and I mean like no longer here. We don't have any idea, and to have this kind of account on the stand does humanize her and puts a face to the victim.
And what we're getting a sense of is this worker saw her come in with bruises to her. And what's happening right now in the courtroom is being asked under cross-examination, are you aware of an abusive ex-boyfriend? And he said, yes, I saw her come in with a black eye. So this becomes a really interesting dynamic about the timeline. This is a circumstantial evidence case. We don't have that direct evidence. Now, in your opinion, have you seen cases like this, maybe even a kidnapping case, be as successful for the prosecution when there is no body? And we're not even talking about Sydney Moore on trial here. We're talking about Tammy Moore. She's a degree separated here. Yeah,
and that's why this is such a huge leap. I think that she's kind of been painted as as the puppet master here, and to connect all of this back to her is a daunting task. But again, going back to the testimony, when we talk about these injuries she sustained and this sort of thing, we know that she was at least within the sphere of violence. That there was a violent reality to her existence. We've got a coworker who knows her. You know, lots of times our coworkers know us better than even some of our peripheral family members do, and they witness people day in and day out. I think that we can all identify with that, and he's seeing this in her life, and again, it humanizes her, and but yet again, this is very, very difficult to prove, Jesse. So it's a hell of an uphill battle.
Well, the prosecution believes that they have enough to go forward with this case, and you see them building it against Tammy Moore. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. And welcome back, everybody. We're still talking about the Tammy Moore case. We are live in that courtroom, but before we go live, there's some discussion we need to have first. Do want to let you know that on the stand before was Dennis Hart. He had worked at the Tilted Kilt with Heather Elvis, the victim in this case. He testified that Tammy Moore once asked him to fire Heather Elvis because of her relationship with Sydney Moore. You heard him also say that Heather was scared of Tammy, and we also saw under cross-examination that Heather and Sydney, yes, were caught having sex at work. So we're learning more details about their relationship, but I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan before we go live into that courtroom. Joseph, we had talked about in the break a little bit. I want to talk about with you this idea of the communications between Sydney and Heather in the moments leading up to her disappearance. We saw that if you analyze her phone record, she was trying to call this payphone a significant amount of time. There was surveillance footage of Sydney Moore doing some interesting things before her disappearance. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yeah, I find the introduction of a payphone of all things is super bizarre for us in the context that we're in today. You know, because you don't find them, and it left me scratching my head as to, you know, why would a cell phone be involved in this? I mean, why would a payphone be involved? What would be the need? Because this was just 2013. We all had cell phones then, and so it's not like you absolutely had a need for it. And the one thing that I keep coming back to is that maybe someone is trying to mask themselves in some way by calling this number, or maybe it's a prearranged location that the two lovers had, for instance, to make calls back and forth. They have history with this, and it would be fascinating to see this history going backwards. I don't know that we'll ever have that per se.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange, and not on top of the fact the Walmart video is showing him buying a pregnancy test, and again, it's believed that Heather may have been pregnant with Sydney's baby at the time of her disappearance, which just adds to the whole bizarre nature of this story.
Yeah, I think that's kind of curious as well, isn't it, Jesse? One of the things that I've been considering in this, why would you need the pregnancy test? He has offered up in the past that it was for his wife. Well, if that's the case, and also it was, bouncing around last week that she might very well testify, I hope that the prosecution would probe her medical history a bit in this area relative to was she capable of becoming pregnant at that point in time in her life, because we don't know anything about her, and so that would be a big question for me. The cigar is I don't know, it's an outlier.
Yeah, the fact that he bought a cigar,
I have no idea, but the pregnancy test is super bizarre for me. Again, were they going to? They both suspected allegedly that this young girl was pregnant. Maybe they're going to use this test in order to leverage or as a confirmatory test, and that just makes this all the more fascinating. What did that pregnancy test, if utilized, reveal at that particular time, and was it the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's so many questions as to what happened. And one of the things that should be noted is that Sydney and Tammy were brought up on murder charges, but they were dropped. Do you think that they were dropped because there is no body? But we've seen cases before where there's a prosecution without a body, where they prosecute for murder without the body. So why did they drop it here?
I don't know. I think that in those cases that you mentioned, I think that you had strong peripheral evidence that could kind of, narrow the field down a bit. In this case, I find it wanting in that area. So, moving forward with a prosecution of a homicide was very difficult. But again, I contend that that kidnapping is as daunting a task as prosecuting a homicide case, because again, look, we're talking about, it doesn't matter what I say or you say or anybody else. What matters are the 12 people in the box. And what they want to know, they have a construct of kidnapping in their mind. Well, they never, they haven't proved that they had possession of her. Was there a ransom note? What was the purpose of the kidnapping? All those sorts of things play into it. So you have to prove that to the jury in order for this thing to get traction. And I don't know. Thus far for me, the most compelling thing is the phone evidence. And maybe they've got more that they're going to bring on to tie everything together. I have no idea.
Right, because it could be a situation where they lured her in a certain area and then just killed her. I mean that's
speculative
a theory.
At best, though.
Speculation. That's all we have to do here because we don't have a lot of evidence. We don't have a lot of information. Joseph, stand by. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, there is so much more to discuss in the Tammy Moore trial. Okay, so that's some testimony there about how Heather Elvis was maybe trying to get a hold of Sydney Moore on the night that she disappeared. It should be noted that we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Jill Domagauer, who's from the police department and basically was assigned to analyze Heather Elvis's car, is currently on the stand. She testified that she found Heather Elvis's Social Security card, her bank card, and a cosmetology license inside her car. She also is testifying that she swabbed the vehicle for DNA and tested for fingerprints on the outside of the car. And she also testified that she did not find Heather's car keys or cell phone. She then went to the boat landing and did not find anything out of the ordinary. She then went to document Heather Elvis's apartment. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I think we have about 20 seconds or so. Based upon what I've said so far, what do you think of this testimony and where's it going?
Oh, I think it's fantastic. She covered the points that we've addressed just a moment ago. I would expect them to do this, to do a thorough examination of this vehicle, just for the process of elimination, Jesse, just to see who was there within that sphere at that critical time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're getting an understanding of she just went missing. There was foul play here, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more. Now, I'm told we have to take a break, so that's what we're going to do. We'll take a quick break on our end, and we'll be right back. Stay tuned. Okay, we are analyzing the different areas of Heather Elvis's life. And you just heard Jill Domagauer testify that she saw a box of pregnancy tests in one of Elvis's trash cans, but never found the test itself. I am back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. You're listening to this, Joseph. This is your meat and potatoes, listening to the different areas that are analyzed here. What do you think about what we're learning about?
Well, she's just given detail right now as to the descriptor of. And that's kind of what needs to happen here. You set the tone for the jury. Remember, she's the prosecutor is asking, well, what does this photo demonstrate? What does this photo demonstrate? And what they're doing, in effect, is familiarizing the jury with the life that this girl had, all that was left behind by her. Of course, we don't have a body, we don't have anything. But what's really interesting to me is that, she asked her pointedly. Did you find any keys? Did you find any keys? And no, they didn't find any car keys. And also, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there were no car keys found with her car or her phone. So that's kind of compelling evidence in and of itself. And
the pregnancy test as well. And it was, we saw that he was on tape buying a pregnancy test, and now there's these pregnancy tests at her apartment. It leads to motive, doesn't it?
Yeah, it kind of does. It puts us at least peripherally in the ballpark. I'd like to know what those brands are. Is there any way to track down the brand that was purchased from Walmart, compare the one that they found in the trash there. Of course, we don't have the applicator as they specifically stated, and that's the key to all of this. I mean, that's what everybody wants to know. You know, aside from where
and everybody wants an answer to this one way or another. Joseph, thank you so much. I know we have to sign you off, but we can't wait to have you back. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.